Please join me in saying the chalice lighting words printed in the order of service. We gather this hour as people of faith. It's so wonderful to see so many people, so many children, and a choir. I feel like a lot is changing in a very positive way in a very short period of time. So sometimes it's good to have someone who isn't here day to day come in and kind of look, and things are looking really great. So now most, if not all of us, have had this conversation many, many times. Unitarian Universalist? What's that? I've spoken with people who have said, it sort of sounds like a cult. I've talked to other people who say, oh yes, you're just like the Baha'is. Well, for the record, except for the fact that we both, albeit in very, very different ways, draw wisdom from all of the world's religions, we have fairly little in common theologically with the Baha'is. But that would be a whole different sermon. Perhaps my favorite experience of this happened several years ago at a party. It was during the time before I met my spouse, and someone had asked me to a party as a date. So I didn't really know anyone at the party, and I didn't really even know the date that well. So I ended up kind of finding myself ditched in the kitchen and on the periphery of one of those conversations that people have in kitchens at parties when the wine is flowing freely. And it was a conversation about religion. And everyone in the group was kind of listening to and deferring to a middle-aged woman who I remember had this gorgeous mane of salt and pepper hair, really, really eccentric fashion sense, and a very charismatic presence. She has a degree in world religions, one of the guests whispered to me as we stood in a circle around her, listening to her expound on her knowledge of Unitarian Universalism. Those Unitarian Universalists are an interesting bunch, she began. They started in California in the late 60s, she explained. You see, the Flower Children had this brilliant insight that all of the world's religions had the same basic message, she went on. But the Flower Children also felt that these messages, while worthy, had been perverted by authority figures who oppressed their members and cozied up to the rich and powerful. So they founded a church in San Francisco based on two principles. One, that there is wisdom in all religions, and two, that no one has any more authority than anyone else. Clergy leaders, etc. In fact, she went on, they have no clergy. Much like the Quakers. And then she said, they're also very liberal and very accepting of things like sex outside of marriage, gay relationships, and yes, even socialism. She then went on to explain that the movement caught on very quickly and spread all over the U.S. There is now a UU meeting house in nearly every city, she concluded. So, wait, they aren't Christians then? Asked this young man with little John Lennon-type glasses and a ponytail. And then he went on, but I went to a wedding at a UU church once, he said, and they had crosses and pictures of Jesus and stained glass windows. She had an answer. Well, she said, yes, Jesus is one of their prophets. So they would definitely try to follow his message of compassion and love for humanity. And they also get involved in a lot of social justice issues like gay rights, championing for the poor and the downtrodden, just like Jesus did. But they wouldn't say he was God, and they wouldn't say that he could perform miracles or anything supernatural. He's just another prophet to them, like the Buddha or Moses or Mohammed. They also have some dietary rules, she said, but I'm not exactly sure what they are. I'm pretty sure they aren't allowed to eat meat like the Buddhists, but I'm not really sure of the specifics, so don't quote me on that, she said, wrapping up her talk. So as I have already explained, I didn't know anyone at this party, and I was merely someone's casual date. And this woman was clearly a beloved expert in this social circle. So I decided not to contribute anything that I knew about Unitarian Universalism or to correct anything that she clearly did not know. So I thought about it later, and she definitely had pieces of our story right. As wrong as she was on so many of the major points, I thought it was an interesting narrative that she had created for us. At the time, I was taking some creative writing classes in a center in Rochester called Writers and Books, and I thought to myself, her story would make a great plot for a novel about the starting of a religion. And still, so I could have obviously taken her to task on many, many of the things she said, if I had chosen to. But at the time when she said it, the main thing that kept coming back to me and I thought about, and I agreed with her on one thing, I thought, UUs are not really Christians. So that was in 2005. And I had begun to change my mind, however. Maybe, just maybe, in a way, we are Christians after all. In fact, maybe we are among the most Christian of all churches in the U.S. And not only that, I think that perhaps our mission for the 21st century might be to return the nation to real Christian values. Now, we've all heard our friends on the right claim that the U.S. is inherently, and from its very inception, a Christian nation. We've all heard that, have we not? And while most of my life I have recoiled when I hear this, lately I've been thinking that maybe, just maybe, it would be a good idea to give this idea a second look. Maybe the U.S. really should be a Christian nation. Perhaps the Christian message actually should guide our policies. It might just be true that we'd be a better country if we were a Christian country. Just like the evangelicals have long advocated. So you have to stay with me. Ironically, think about this. If the United States were to become a truly Christian nation, our friends on the right would have to do a lot more accommodating and a lot more adjusting than we would have to do. Because as off-base as our eccentric world religions expert at the party obviously was on many aspects of Unitarian Universalism, I do agree wholeheartedly with one thing that she said. And it's the most important thing. We definitely do try to follow Jesus' message of compassion and love for humanity. And if our friends on the right followed suit, many, many aspects of our culture and our public policy would look a lot different, wouldn't they? So we all know Facebook has its downsides. But anyone who hears me speak on a regular basis also knows that it has given me a lot of preaching material in the last 10 years. And recently, a college friend of mine, a person who identifies as a devout Christian, provided me with a really great example of what I'm talking about. So I shared a post which said the following: I was hungry, and you cut my food stamps. I was thirsty, and you poured my water on the ground. I was a stranger, and you took my child and put us in cages. I needed clothing and shelter, and you told me to sleep on the floor. I was sick, and you denied me health care. I was in prison for the profit of your friend. Whatever you do to the least of my people, you do unto me. Signed, Jesus. So a few hours after I posted that, my friend Tomohiro wrote, quote, "Many politicians who claim to be Christian don't show any empathy toward people who have traveled for hundreds of miles, often risking their lives, seeking better lives. Instead, they categorically label immigrants as racist, rapists, and drug smugglers. Obviously, their Christian love doesn't extend to people who look different from them." I agreed with him, and I added this quote, "Yes, it is hard to imagine Jesus putting up razor wire in the middle of a river or refusing to give water to someone who is literally dying of thirst. I must have missed the parts of the Bible that covered those things when I was in seminary." Maybe an hour later or so, my college friend Margaret, the devout Christian, the evangelical Christian, wrote, "The role of the individual Christian is to show mercy, but the role of civil authority is to execute justice. As believers, individually, we are to display Christ's love to everyone, legal or illegal. But the role of the government is to defend citizens against law-breaking, such as illegal immigration. And even heaven has a gate." Even heaven has a gate. Even heaven has a gate? I was incensed. What arrogance, what callousness, what privilege. Even heaven has a gate? When I responded to her, I didn't think at all. It was automatic, intuitive, and quick. A gut-level response. In fact, I'm not sure I was even fully finished. My heaven does not have a gate. It was an instinctive response from a soundly Christian perspective. I almost surprised myself. For the last 40 years at least, I'd been telling myself that I wasn't a Christian, that I didn't believe in heaven or hell. And while I don't believe in heaven or hell, I am, in many ways, I believe, more Christian than I thought I was. And more importantly, perhaps there is more value in using that paradigm and imagery when advocating compassion and fighting for justice than there can be found in reciting our principles and purposes to people who are outside of our church. It certainly worked with Margaret. In fact, it worked amazingly well in a way that was much more effective and much less divisive than any discussion of politics could ever be. Because just a few minutes after I wrote that little piece about being a universalist and my heaven not having a gate, she wrote back. The fundamentalist evangelical person who had been defending the razor wire in the middle of the river a few minutes before wrote this back to me. "I somewhat agree," she said. "I may be more universalist than Presbyterian on getting into heaven. All I know is that it is not my job to let people in or keep people out of heaven. I can certainly control my own actions and my own beliefs." Now, anyone who has ever gotten into one of these Facebook back and forth will agree with me. That is a lot of progress in a very, very short amount of time. And I believe it happened because I spoke her language on her terms. I have come to believe that perhaps the average American is more likely to listen to and to understand a message grounded in familiar Christian terms. Way better and way easier and way more open-mindedly than they are one that is based on politics or on differing concepts of justice. And I also believe that while non-religious in language, our principles and purposes are, in fact, way truer to the real Christian message than anything any evangelical preacher or politician has ever said. So, perhaps then, it's time to take a fresh look at this. Maybe it is time that we reclaimed our Christian heritage and brought the fight for justice and compassion to them on their terms, using their language and their imagery. Now, let's be clear, I am not saying that we should adopt a creed, exclude people who don't believe, or limit our source of inspiration to the Bible, or begin to pray to an anthropomorphic being, or start having communion, or any of those things that we associate with traditional Christianity. But I am saying this. I am wondering if maybe we would be able to make a more meaningful contribution to the conversation if we played up just a little bit our completely, by the way, legitimate claim to being a well-established Christian faith with roots that go back many centuries. And if we became just a little bit more comfortable speaking their language when the occasion calls for it. We'd be on extremely solid ground, philosophically. Besides our legitimate Christian roots of not just one, but two denominations, and in spite of the fact that our principles and purposes are solidly aligned, in my opinion, with the true message of Jesus, we have also an incredibly rich and bold history and track record of putting our faith into action. I could do an entire year's worth of sermons just on the justice work Unitarian Universalists have done and some of the wonderful, prophetic, and brave people who have done some truly heroic things in our history. If we started to talk like this, we'd also avoid the kind of confusion over who we are, which led our kitchen party expert to give such a muddled description of us. Now, we've all talked about the elevator speech. Well, the elevator speech is probably fine for us to use internally, and it's also a valuable tool to use with those honest seekers who are truly considering joining us. But when standing up to our friends on the religious right and matters of justice, maybe playing up our version of Christianity would be more effective. I don't have to tell anyone here this morning that the stakes are getting higher and higher and higher every day, and time is running out. Much of the planet is on fire. Authoritarianism is on the rise in once stable democracies, including the United States. Children are being shot at school. Most of the Earth's people live in desperate poverty, and in the last month we have all watched in horror what is unfolding in Israel. The world would indeed be a better place if the real message, the real true message of Jesus took hold in more hearts and minds, wouldn't it? Perhaps in this particular case, when the stakes are so high and the amount of time is so short, perhaps the ends are important enough to justify the means. Isn't saving lives, working for justice, and saving the planet more important than reading one line ahead whenever we are singing a hymn to make sure that we don't inadvertently say or sing a word that doesn't completely and totally align with our beliefs? Because as Unitarian Universalists, we believe in each individual having the right to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and more, at least as importantly, we believe that everyone has the right to exercise conscience in what they do. So for those reasons, each and every single one of us here this morning has to decide that matter for themselves. So I am only offering my own reflection and the place that I've come to in this journey. I actually decided, though, for myself several decades ago what was important to me and what was not so important when I was doing my hospital chaplaincy training in Chicago. I have told this story before, but briefly, I was paged to a room to see Mrs. Johnson, who was an elderly African-American woman who was 75 years old. Mrs. Johnson had had a very hard life, spending 30 years in the now demolished Cabrini Green housing project. She lamented that most of her grandchildren were involved in drugs. Her son was in prison, and her daughter was too busy to visit her. She told me about life in Cabrini Green. It's rough, she said. You can't even leave the doors and windows open when it's hot because strange men come running into your apartment hiding from the police. Mrs. Johnson confided in me that she was feeling about the lowest she'd ever felt. As we talked, it became more and more clear that all that stood between Mrs. Johnson and her total despair was her faith in Jesus. I keep telling my roommate here that all I need is Dr. Jesus, she told me. All I got is God. My whole family has forgot about me, I got no money, and I got cancer. It's all so sad. All I have left is Jesus and the good book, but that's all I need, isn't it, Reverend? She asked me. And then she went on. You're the only person around here who can understand this, she said to me, confident that I shared her theology. The doctors here, they think I need pills, but they're wrong because the pills can't do nothing without Dr. Jesus. Aren't I right, Reverend? Mrs. Johnson was very lonely and in the depths of despair. What she needed in that moment was to have her experiences heard by another person, and she needed someone to share her reality with her. And she also needed to speak with someone who could validate her faith in Jesus. The faith that she'd held her whole entire life. The faith that had sustained her through all of the difficulties. And the only thing that she had left that she was holding on to. Now, I didn't really say anything. My role as a chaplain was enough for her to assume that I shared her faith in the same way that she did. It sounded from what I could gather that there were few religious people in her life, and what she needed in that moment was to see evidence of God and godly people. At that moment, I was her witness for Christ. And it didn't matter at all that my theology was different than hers. In fact, if I had told her what I really believed, I would have failed her miserably. I would have changed from a beacon of hope into another reason for despair right in front of her eyes. A minister who doesn't believe Jesus was God? Surely this would have been seen as another sign of the end times. I needed in that moment to set myself aside, and if I had not done so, I would have not only failed her miserably, but I would have been saying to any concept I had of God, and I would have been saying to the universe and to my fellow human beings, this isn't my job. Get someone else. I have more than enough opportunities whenever I want to discuss my own personal theology. But I only had one opportunity to provide some much-needed comfort to someone who was in desperate need. And so I entered her reality with her and spoke her language with her. So I have decided for myself in recent years that if speaking as a Christian is okay when I'm providing comfort, then it is okay when I am fighting being dishonest or false to my beliefs either if I do this. Because I most definitely am a Christian if being a Christian is defined as our eccentric party expert did. Quote, a person who tries to follow Jesus' message of compassion and justice and love for humanity. Not only is there nothing non-Unitarian Universalist about that, I would argue that it is the very essence of our faith. Think about it. Our first principle affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Well, isn't that the essence of Jesus' message? Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations? That's really so obvious it doesn't even need to be said or restated. Acceptance of one another. You can't have compassion without full and unconditional acceptance, the kind that Jesus modeled. Affording everyone the opportunity to pursue a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. That requires all of the above, does it not? Respect, compassion, acceptance, equality. And that goes also for the exercise of conscience and the democratic process as well. You can't have those things without justice, equity, compassion, love, charity. And the goal of the world community, of course, also, does that not lead us back to the same place? And respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part simply requires us to extend our compassion and respect beyond humanity to all living things and to the earth itself. If you think about it, it's all one unified message which applies to everyone, everywhere. What could be more Unitarian or universal? So this morning, I'm calling for a return to Christian values, real Christian values, among Unitarian Universalists, among those who identify as Christians, among all Americans, and of all citizens of the world. The world needs all of the compassion and Christian charity it can get. And it is, after all, our heritage. We have very legitimately Christian roots. And thus, think about it this way, we have just as much right as any other Christian denomination to define what it means to be a Christian. And it's not about miracles or heaven, and it is certainly not about any gate of any kind. It is about inclusion and compassion and equity and justice. I won't be back until spring, but the next time that I am back here in our UU meeting house, I will tell you the whole story of just exactly how the Flower Children started our movement in the late 60s. Bring your notebooks, because I will explain to you in detail all of our strict dietary rules. And feel free to wear your most eccentric outfit, because you want to make sure that you will fit in. I think that's the first time I ever got applause.